The first sound was porcelain giving up. A coffee cup hit the hardwood at the edge of my section and burst into white shards that skittered under velvet banquettes. In the cinder room, a Boston Seaport supper club, nothing broke by accident. Not under the amber lamps, not while men in tailored suits pretended they were here for jazz and oysters instead of power. My name is Rachel Hayes. I'm 29, a single mom, and that night I wore a black apron. I had mastered being invisible. You keep your eyes down. You keep your smile soft. You let the rich and dangerous believe you are part of the furniture. Furniture doesn't get remembered. I bent for the pieces on instinct, already rehearsing how to make myself smaller. Then my stomach went cold, because the cup wasn't the problem. The problem was the silence that followed. It wasn't the polite hush of a classy room. It was controlled, like someone had turned the volume down so a single sound could carry. My gaze pulled toward booth 9 before I meant to. That was Gavin Rowe's booth. The Dock King. The man whose name people in South Boston treated like a warning label. Gavin always looked like the storm had asked him for permission. He usually sat with his back to the wall, eyes calm, and his security posted like shadows at every angle. That night, the angle was wrong. Gavin was there, but the gravity around him felt dented. His face stayed composed, yet his eyes kept flicking to the corners like he was doing math faster than the room could keep up. His right hand rested near the table edge, not reaching for a drink, not reaching for food, ready, waiting, and there were no shadows. No familiar suits by the hallway. No earpieces. No quiet scanning. The men who normally made the air around Gavin feel thick were gone, like someone had erased them between one song and the next. Victor Sloan sat to Gavin's left, close enough to look like family. People called him Gavin's brother. Though in that world, brother could mean blood oath or leverage. Victor wore the same expensive calm as everyone else, but his stillness was different. He wasn't relaxed. He was posed, like a man holding his breath for a curtain to rise. The broken cup had been a cue. My eyes started catching details the way they do when your body decides you don't get to stay ignorant. Untouched drinks on 3 tables near booth 9, condensation rings perfect and unbroken. 2 men in bulky jackets, even though the club ran warm, their left sides heavier, their right hands never quite leaving their laps. A server I didn't recognize was hovering too close to the service corridor, checking his watch. The kitchen door was shut. Not just shut, locked. I knew because I'd tried it earlier for glassware and found the handle dead in my palm. Management had smiled and told me access had changed for the night. I'd swallowed it then because swallowing is what you do when you have a kid at home and rent due. Caleb's face flashed in my mind now. The way his hair stuck up after a bath. The way he said goodnight like he was making sure I heard him. My whole life was built on leaving places alive so I could come home and pack lunches and pretend the world didn't hunt people. I should have walked away. I should have gathered the shards and disappeared. But my gaze snagged on Victor again, and something inside me turned hard. He wasn't watching Gavin. He was watching the room, watching exits, watching the band's tempo, watching for the moment everyone would be looking somewhere else. His mouth stayed neutral, but his eyes held a quiet satisfaction I'd only ever seen on men who believed the ending was already decided. A hand shifted under a table near the bar. A metal glint. Not a phone, not a lighter. My throat tightened. My thoughts ran fast. This is an execution. In my section, in my shift, in front of people who will pretend they saw nothing and leave a tip to buy their own silence. The air smelled like mahogany, whiskey, and expensive perfume laid over fear. Velvet swallowed sound. The singer kept going while my pulse tried to crawl out of my skin. I moved before my brain could argue. I stood too fast, the serving tray in my left hand catching the light. My body remembered something my mind didn't want to claim. Some old reflex about angles, timing, and impact. I didn't have a plan. I had a second. The first shot came as a twitch, not a bang. A suppressed crack hidden inside the music, aimed at booth 9. I threw the tray. It flew flat and fast, a silver disc across a room that pretended it was a sanctuary. It hit the table edge beside Gavin with a violent clang, flipping glass, sending ice and dark liquor into the air. The bullet that should have taken his throat punched into metal instead and ricocheted with a scream I felt in my teeth. For one breath, every face turned toward me. The harmless waitress, the invisible woman. Then chairs scraped, someone gasped. And I knew the next sound would be much louder. The tray's clang hadn't even finished echoing when the room confessed what it was. Glass burst. Velvet shredded. Chairs skidded. The band kept playing for a breath out of instinct. Then the music collapsed under screams and the blunt hammering crack of gunfire. I didn't get to decide whether I was brave. My body moved first. Gavin Rowe started to rise, eyes hunting the shooter like he expected a wall of men to appear around him. But his security was gone, no black suits, no earpieces, no familiar shoulders between him and death. I grabbed the back of his jacket and hauled him down into the booth so hard his shoulder hit wood. A bullet punched through the mahogany divider above us and turned it into a spray of splinters. I shoved the table over, dragging it toward the booth until it wedged like a shield. My palms burned on the slick linen. My breath tasted like espresso and fear. My pulse hammered in my ears. Cover. Stay low. Don't give them a clean line. My eyes cut through chaos in fast snapshots. The shooters weren't panicked. They were coordinated. Bulky jackets by the bar, arms extended, firing in controlled bursts, stitching the booths to herd Gavin into an angle. Another shot came from higher up mezzanine level because the bullets were biting down into the tabletop before tearing into velvet. People crawled under tables like shadows. The kitchen door was locked, stubborn, turning the back of house into a trap if we couldn't reach the service corridor. And Victor Sloan, Gavin's brother, in everything but blood, was still upright. He wasn't ducking. He wasn't scrambling. His face held that quiet stillness I'd seen when he watched accounts get settled and problems disappear. His betrayal of him wasn't dramatic. It was managerial, like Gavin's death was paperwork that needed a signature. That clean, cold fact lit something in me. Men are treating human life like an item on a list, turning strangers into collateral because it made the math easier. I peeked just enough over the table edge to read the angles without offering my whole head. The closest shooter had the bar lights behind him, warm pendants turning the whole side of the room into a stage. So I stole the light. I grabbed a bottle off the floor, something expensive, slick with liquor, and hurled it into the cluster of hanging glass. Crystal exploded. Bulbs popped. Sparks jumped. The bar side dropped into dim, ragged shadow. The shooters hesitated. Not long, just long enough. I yanked Gavin lower and dragged him along the booth base, keeping him down, moving in short pulls. His breath was sharp beside mine, the kind of control that hates being handled. I didn't care. If he stood up, he died. Caleb flashed through my mind like a warning light, his sneakers by the door, his sleepy hug when I left for shifts. If I died here, he wouldn't just lose me. He'd be handed to a world that never notices boys like him until it's too late. Another shot snapped into the table, closer. The upstairs shooter had adjusted, chasing our movement. We needed more than darkness. We needed chaos that belonged to us. The aquarium wall behind the bar, an expensive ribbon of water meant to impress people who'd never been truly thirsty, sat right where the shooters were planted. I'd cleaned fingerprints off that glass 100 times. I knew the seam at the corner was weak. I crawled to the service station, fingers fumbling under fire, and tore the fire extinguisher from its bracket. The pin fought me. I ripped it out anyway, then swung the metal canister into the aquarium's corner seam. The glass held for one cruel second. Then it gave. Water detonated into the bar. Bottles crashed. Stools toppled. A wave of salt water and shattered glass washed over the shooter's feet and killed the tank lights in a flicker. The whole side of the room became wet darkness and spray, a curtain of mist that turned clean angles into guesses. Gunfire restarted, angrier, less precise. I didn't wait for luck to fade. I shoved Gavin forward, one hand locked on his shoulder blade, guiding him in a low, stumbling rush along the booths toward the service corridor. I kicked the corridor door open with my heel and forced him through first. The air changed the instant we crossed less perfume, more dish soap, and steam and metal. Behind us, footsteps pounded closer, and I knew, right then, that I wasn't invisible anymore. The service corridor swallowed us hot, metallic, reeking of bleach, then opened into the kitchen where every sound rang. Someone crouched behind the prep table, eyes locked on me as if my apron had dragged danger inside. I didn't have time to explain. I had time to move. I shoved Gavin toward the back door, keeping my body between him and the corridor. The gun in my hand felt unreal and inevitable. My black apron was soaked, clinging to my legs. The dark smears on it weren't mine, which meant someone else had already paid for my hesitation. Footsteps hit behind us, measured and steady. Victor's kind. The back door bar fought me for a heartbeat. Then it slid free, and cold air knifed in. Boston slapped my face with harbor rain and dumpster heat, wet brick and salt. The alley was a slick canyon under sodium lamps, fire escapes above, puddles below. We burst out, and the noise changed. Rain hissed on asphalt. Boots closed fast. Gunfire cracked sharp enough to taste. A bullet sparked off a metal ladder, spitting white pinpricks down the wall. I yanked Gavin right. into the shadow of stacked bins. Cover mattered. Angles mattered. The alley funneled sightlines straight to us. I forced my breathing into something usable. In through my nose, out through my teeth. I checked the weapon and counted what I had left, the way my hands remembered even when my mind wanted to freeze. Not much. Enough if I stayed disciplined. Another shot Chipidi brick above my head. I moved us in short bursts, using the bins as a rolling shield. Gavin stayed low. But I felt his tension. The disbelief of a man realizing his own room had been turned into a trap. The armored car waited near the alley mouth, a black block of steel and tinted glass. It looked like salvation, until I realized it was also a beacon. I reached for the handle. Nothing. For a half second, my stomach dropped. The lock didn't recognize me. That tiny delay was the kind of delay people die in. Victor's men spilled into the alley, hoods up, guns raised, faces hidden by rain. They didn't spray wildly. They placed their shots, trying to pin us. I didn't aim for heroics. I aimed for seconds. I fired into the overhead light. The bulb burst, and the alley mouth stuttered into darkness. Then I kicked a metal lid into the puddle so it clanged and skittered sideways, pulling eyes and muzzles for one breath. Gavin's hand moved near his pocket, and the car answered locks snapping open. I shoved him into the back seat first, then climbed in after him, dragging my apron with me like it wanted to snag and hold me outside. The door slammed, sealing the rain and gunfire into a dull thump. The tires bit. The car surged forward, swallowing the alley. Light smeared across the wet windshield as we punched onto the street. My breathing was louder than the engine for a few seconds, all air and panic trapped in my ribs. Then the silence arrived. My ears rang. My fingers hurt from gripping too hard. Water dripped from my hair onto the leather, and I couldn't tell if it was rain or sweat. I stared at my hands. Waitress's hands, raw from sanitizer and hot plates, wrapped around a weapon. The stained apron that used to make me invisible now looked like evidence. Gavin turned toward me. In the dim, his shock was already turning into calculation. He was taking inventory who betrayed him, what it cost, who survived, and he was adding me to that list. I tried to shrink back into the lie that used to keep me safe. Just Rachel. Just the woman who refills water and disappears. But I could still see Victor's calm face in my memory, watching me move. He had seen me the instant I stopped being nobody. That was the real twist. The cleanup wasn't only about Gavin. It was about erasing witnesses and loose ends. The harmless waitress was now a problem to solve. Caleb's face flashed sleep-warm cheeks, his backpack by the door for school. Going home meant leading hunters straight to him. It meant my apartment door became an easy target because I'd been careless enough to keep breathing. I wanted out. I wanted to be dropped off somewhere normal, to pretend this ended when I turned my own key. But Gavin's posture said no. Not as a threat, as a decision. He wasn't going to let me step back into the open with Victor's men hunting. Not after I'd been seen doing what I did. The car cut through Seaport rain, and with every block, my old life closed like a door I couldn't reach in time. Not anymore, ever. The drive to the harbor felt unreal. Rain turning the city into smeared neon behind bulletproof glass. My apron clung cold to my legs, and the gun in my hand dragged at my wrist now that the adrenaline was draining. In the club, it had been a tool. In the quiet, it felt like evidence. We slid into a private garage beneath a seaport tower. The air smelled like salt, concrete, and exhaust trapped under money. Gavin moved with that controlled speed men learn when they can't afford to wobble. A reinforced door opened with a soft beep and a heavier click. Private elevator. No lobby. No witnesses. The doors shut, and we rose, smooth as a lie. My shoulders started to ache in earnest. My arms finally remembering what it took to haul him down and keep him alive. The moment of the cup shattering kept replaying behind my eyes. The instant I stopped being invisible. The instant I chose. When the elevator opened, the penthouse looked like a magazine spread someone forgot to warm up. Harbor views, dark hardwood, furniture built to impress. Then the security edges showed themselves. Steel shutters slid over the glass with a hydraulic sigh. Locks engaged in a sequence that sounded like a vault ceiling. Camera feeds glowed on a wall of screens. Luxury, but not comfort. Safety, but also captivity. I stood just inside the entry while the place closed around us. My wet shoes left prints on the polished floor. The gun felt heavier with every second, as if it understood we weren't running anymore. I flexed my fingers around it, thumb along the frame, finger clear. Habit, not bravado. Caleb hit me like a sudden ache. His face in the cheap glow of our kitchen light, hair sticking up. asking if I would be home for dinner. The thought of Victor's men finding our apartment made my stomach go cold. I swallowed hard and forced my spine straighter, because Victor had seen my face. Going home meant death at our door, and I couldn't let Caleb pay for it. Gavin's attention landed on me heavier than bullets. In the cinder room, I had been a shadow carrying plates. Here, I was the unknown variable that had changed his outcome. I felt him trying to classify me without wasting time on kindness. Rival plant, desperate civilian, undercover, bait. His suspicion didn't roar. It measured. I tried to retreat into the mask that had kept me alive for years. Eyes down, shoulders rounded, small movements. But my instincts betrayed me. I clocked the exits anyway. I noted where the cameras didn't overlap. I heard the shutters and counted their cycle by ear. When a secondary door engaged, I knew from the sound whether it was a deadbolt or a sliding bar. Those are survival thoughts. He noticed. Of course he did. A man with a headset appeared, moving quickly and quietly, his gaze flicking to me like I was an item on a list. A phone glowed in his hand. I didn't need to hear anything. They were running me. Gavin glanced down at the screen, and something in his face tightened. Not anger, not relief, but the recognition of a problem. I caught the glow long enough to see neat blocks. My name, my age, a job history that looked boring on purpose. One apartment, one child, no mess, no debts, no court records. A life scrubbed clean until it looked manufactured. That was the twist inside the calm. Real people have stains. Real single moms have paper trails. Mine had gaps, smooth edges, too perfect to be true. I didn't need an accusation to feel the trap closing. If my file was fake, someone built it. If someone built it, I was either a weapon or a leash. I lifted my chin slowly. I didn't raise the gun, but I didn't set it down either. I let my posture say what my mouth couldn't afford yet. Intimidation would not make me fold, only make me choose sharper boundaries. In that sealed, beautiful cage, I understood the simple math. If I kept lying, I would lose. Either I'd be owned, or I'd be erased. The only move left was truth, but not all of it. Not raw. Not surrendered. Controlled. Measured. On my terms. As the shutters finished locking us in, I decided that in the next breath, I would tell Gavin Rowe what my father taught me about staying alive. Gavin didn't have to raise his voice to make the penthouse feel smaller. The shutters sealed. The locks clicked. The camera feeds glowed. His suspicion cut through the rain and gunpowder clinging to my apron. I could have kept playing harmlessly. I could have shrunk back into the mask that used to keep me alive. But the background check he ran on Rachel Hayes was too perfect. And we both knew perfect is another word for made. If I didn't give him something real, he would build his own story around me. And in his world, stories end with bodies. So I chose the only kind of truth that ever saved me. Controlled truth. Rachel Hayes is not the name I was born with. It's the name I built on purpose, like a safe room inside a burning house. I built it for my son, Caleb. I built it because the only thing I ever wanted was boring. My father taught me early that boring isn't an accident. Boring is a skill. He was an off-the-books fixer, one of those men sent to clean up messes nobody wanted traced back. In our neighborhood, he was a rumor. In our house, he was my dad. Tired eyes, careful hands, love that came out sideways as rules. The basement was my first classroom. Concrete floor, a single swinging bulb, dust on the steps. A hard case on a folding table that smelled faintly like oil. The lesson was never violence. The lesson was respect for risk, for distance, for consequences. He taught me to notice. Blindfold on, tennis balls thrown without warning, hard enough to sting if I didn't move. He changed the rhythm on purpose, teaching my body to listen for the shift, not the pattern I wanted. He made me walk across the basement without making a sound. He yanked me out of doorways again and again until my instincts learned it. Doorways are frames, and frames are where people get shot. And always the rules, repeated until they lived in my bones. Be boring on purpose. Read hands before faces. Never stand still where someone can line you up. Trust patterns, not promises. If the room feels wrong, it is wrong. Those rules are why I moved into the cinder room before my fear could argue with me. It wasn't bravery. It was conditioning. After drills, he'd hand me water and watch my hands settle. He'd sit on the steps like the weight of his secrets hurt. I didn't know the details. I only knew he was building me a shield out of attention and restraint because he couldn't promise he'd always be there. Then one day, he wasn't. People like my father don't get clean goodbyes. They leave gaps, A missed call, a door that doesn't open again, a story that arrives through someone else's mouth with all the soft parts stripped out. After that, my mother and I did what he trained me to do. We disappeared. Papers changed. Addresses changed. My name became something plain enough to slide through a crowd. And I learned the last rule he never had to say. If you want to survive, you keep moving even when it breaks you. Years later, I thought I'd outrun it. I chose waitressing because it was honest work that didn't ask questions. I chose dim rooms and black aprons because being unseen felt like safety. I built routines for Caleb, lunch packed, shoes by the door, bedtime stories like other mothers build fortresses. Gavin watched me like every sentence rearranged the room. His shock didn't soften him. It sharpened him. I could feel his mind reaching for the name behind my name, the way men in his world trade legends like currency. When I let my father's old alias surface, Mason Pike, I saw it land with recognition. With the quiet chill of a man realizing the waitress in front of him wasn't supposed to exist in his orbit at all. Saying it felt like opening a door I'd welded shut. I thought of Caleb, and panic flared, immediate and ugly. If Victor was cleaning up witnesses, he wouldn't stop at me. He'd follow the thread to my son without blinking. And that was the part my father never let me forget. The past doesn't end because you want it to. It waits. It watches. It learns your schedule. As the penthouse hummed with its lockdown electricity, something else hummed inside me, an old instinct waking up, scratching at the edges of tonight. The missing security. The way the shooters moved was like a rehearsal. My father used to warn me that timelines get nudged and betrayal rarely arrives loud. My father always said shadows blink once before they swallow you, and tonight I saw that blink. I couldn't stop thinking about the timing. For a minute, the penthouse almost felt like it could hold. Gavin went straight to systems. Shutters, locks, feeds, money. He moved with that Doc King calm that usually makes other people breathe easier. Like control is contagious. Tonight, it was a costume he kept adjusting. I stood in my soaked black apron with a gun that still felt too real in my hand. The cinder room was behind us, but my body didn't believe in behind anymore. My fingers kept checking the weight and grip. My ears kept waiting for the glass to break. Gavin made a call like it was a lifeline. The one person he treated as safe. His longtime accountant, Ethan Mercer, is the man who supposedly carried encrypted ledgers, access routes, and emergency cash. I watched Gavin's shoulders drop a fraction, relief sneaking in. That tiny drop woke my father's rule in my head. Pattern over promises. I didn't know Ethan. I didn't need to. I knew Boston, and I knew time. Rain had turned the seaport into a mirror of brake lights and sirens. Roads near the waterfront choke fast on nights like this. People don't glide through it unless they planned for it. The security console flashed an arrival window for Ethan. Minutes, it insisted. Simple. Clean. My stomach tightened. Minutes didn't fit. Not unless Ethan had already been close. Not unless the door was already open. I stepped to the monitors without asking. Blue light washed over the room, over the expensive surfaces that were also reinforced edges. Front entrance, empty sidewalk, wet stone, no waiting cars, service dock, locked, garage, closed. Then the alley feed caught something my instincts grabbed like a throat. A van is idling 2 buildings down. No plates, no hazard lights, no indecision. Just a steady engine and a perfect position, tucked under a flickering street lamp like it knew where the cameras were. The side door slid open. 4 men stepped out. They weren't Victor's panicky club shooters. These men moved like work. Tight spacing, clean corners, heads up, hands close. One carried a long case. One had a rigid pack. None of them looked up at the penthouse windows. They already knew the floor. My father's other rule echoed. Check the timeline, because lies can't outrun distance. Gavin's phone buzzed again with Ethan's update. I watched Gavin read it, wanting loyalty so badly it almost overrode the warning in his eyes. Caleb flashed in my mind, sleepy face, warm skin, that soft sound he makes when he trusts me completely. If I went home with this target on my back, I wasn't just risking myself. I was bringing the hunt to him. On the monitor, the men moved. One pressed a device onto a service door like a sticker. Another covered the hallway. Their timing was smooth, almost bored. Then the lights blinked. Power cut. The penthouse went quiet in a way that felt wrong. The screens blacked out, then snapped to backup with harsh contrast. Somewhere below us, an elevator made a sound too smooth, too certain, like someone had bypassed the building's rules. They were inside. Coming up, Gavin shifted. grabbing a small case and a secondary weapon, trying to place me in his head as a threat or an asset. I didn't wait to be categorized. This was the part where you either move or you get pinned. Professionals would come with night vision, lasers, better numbers, better angles. So I chose something simple: water and light. I dumped an ice bucket across the marble, so the floor turned treacherous and loud. I swung a bottle into the sprinkler head near the hallway. Glass cracked, metal snapped. Water burst down in a cold sheet, turning air into mist. I ripped open the emergency kit and found a flare. My hands were steady in the moment, like muscle memory was a rope I could climb. I struck it. Red light bloomed, brutal and bright. The mist caught it and threw it everywhere, off mirrors, off stainless steel, off wet marble. Night vision would turn it into a whiteout. Laser dots would scatter into glitter. Even trained men hate losing their eyes. Footsteps hit the hall outside the penthouse door. Heavy. Certain. The lock began to whine as a tool chewed at the seam. My pulse slammed in my throat. I tasted metal and rain, and the memory of the first shot. I stopped. I had wanted boring. I had wanted invisible. I had wanted to go home after my shift. The door gave a fraction. Water kept raining. The flare hissed and spat. Through the mist, I saw shapes hesitate, then back up, coughing and blinking. It bought us seconds, not safety. Whoever hired them had money and planning. We moved, not toward the elevator, not toward the front, toward the balcony doors facing the harbor, where the wind was sharp and the drop was real. Gavin clutched his case like it held his kingdom. I clutched the gun like it held my son's future. The balcony door opened, and the night poured in salt air, rain, darkness, and the first promise of the roof. The balcony hit me like a slap. Wind off the harbor shoved rain sideways into my eyes. My shoes skidded on the metal deck, and I caught the railing with both hands. Because up here, one mistake wasn't embarrassment, it was air. Behind us, the penthouse door groaned, then screamed as a tool bit deeper. The flare and water had bought seconds, nothing more. Gavin stepped out first, and the night tried to take him. His coat snapped in the wind. Rain ran off his jaw. He was bruised and moving stiff, but he still carried that Doc King certainty, the belief that the world would make room if he kept walking. I didn't have that luxury. I had Caleb's face behind my ribs, and the sick thought that a mother can die somewhere her child can't even find. We moved along the edge, hugging the building as it could protect us. I stayed half a step behind Gavin, gun up, scanning corners, roof lines, the overhang above. My father's rule pulsed in my head. Read hands, not stories. The service ladder should have been near the HVAC cages. I remembered it from slow nights, when I cleared tables and stayed invisible. Tonight, invisibility was a costume that had burned off my skin. The door behind us finally gave. Footsteps spilled onto the balcony in a tight rhythm, not the messy panic from the club. These were the men from the van, and they moved like they'd rehearsed the path to our bodies. I dropped behind a concrete planter and fired 2 quick shots, not to win, just to make them hesitate. Recoil jarred my arms. One of them shifted, and I caught the blink of an optic before he tucked it away. Gavin pushed toward the corner where the balcony narrowed under an overhang. The overhang made a funnel. We were being herded, politely, toward fewer exits. The height became its own enemy. Wind pulled at my balance. Rain turned the ledge slick. When I glanced down, my stomach hollowed. Cars crawled like toys. A burst hit the railing, metal sparking inches from my hand. I flinched, furious. My magazine felt wrong in my palm. I forced my breath steady and counted what I had left by touch. Not enough. We reached the corner. The maintenance hatch was there, but the lock was old. My wet fingers slipped on the latch. Gavin tried once. Hard, like force could replace luck. It didn't. Footsteps closed in. One mercenary moved wide to cut off the ladder route. Another advanced straight toward us, weapon steady, posture relaxed. He didn't rush because he didn't need to. He had the angle, and he knew I was trapped between open air and his barrel. I raised my gun anyway and squeezed. Nothing. A hollow click that felt louder than any shot I'd fired tonight. My hands went cold. My mind scrambled through fixes, clearing drills, anything. But my grip was slick and shaking now. The mercenary lifted his weapon a fraction, aligning. I saw his finger settle, calm as paperwork. Caleb flashed again. Not as a thought, but as a physical ache. His damp hair after a bath. His laugh when he thinks I'm brave. The promise I whisper every night, that I will always come back. I knew that posture. I knew the inevitability of it. Then one precise crack cut the air. The mercenary's head snapped back, and his body folded, dropping hard onto the wet decking. No spray, no second shot, just an outcome. For half a second, nobody moved. Not me, not Gavin, not the remaining men. I stared past the body into the dark roofs across the harbor. The shot had come from far away. The angle was wrong for anyone near us. It was the kind of shot you take when you've already measured the world. My father's warning rose up like a ghost hand. The shadows might blink. Friends you buried might still be watching. The mercenaries shifted outward, scanning for the shooter, and that gave us the only gift that matters in a chase. Movement. Gavin grabbed my sleeve and yanked me toward a narrow service door tucked under the overhang. I didn't think. I followed, lungs burning, feet slipping, heart hammering. We shoved through and spilled into a dark stairwell that smelled like rust and wet concrete. Behind us, the rooftop stayed alive with confusion and rain, and the question I couldn't swallow. Who just saved me? And why? The motel sign buzzed, throwing pink light across puddles. We rolled in with our headlights off, coasting as if sound could be traced. This place sat beyond Boston, wedged between a gas station and a dark line of trees, the kind of stop where nobody asked names. When I pushed the door open, stale heat hit my face. The room smelled like old carpet, bleach, and cigarettes trapped in the walls. Peeling wallpaper lifted at the corners. A heater sat under the window. The bedspread looked shiny and exhausted. Velvet and mahogany had promised safety. This was honesty. Flickering neon leaking through thin curtains, wet clothes clinging to my back, and a gun that felt heavier now that my hands had stopped shaking. I locked the door, then checked it again. Deadbolt. Chain. My fingers still moved like they belonged to someone my father raised. I slid the nightstand 2 inches so the legs would scrape loud if the door opened. I set a plastic cup from the bathroom on the edge of the dresser. A cheap alarm. I kept the curtain seam barely cracked, just enough to watch the lot without turning us into silhouettes. Gavin sank onto the bed like gravity finally collected its debt. Under the harsh lamp, the Dock King looked like a man dragged through rain and betrayal. His knuckles were split. A bruise climbed his cheekbone. He tested his ribs with one careful breath, deciding if something inside was broken. I didn't ask permission. I grabbed the cleanest towel I could find, ran hot water until it turned lukewarm, and dabbed at the dried blood along his hairline. Slow, careful, pain makes even powerful men unpredictable. He watched me with the same calculating attention he had given me upstairs, but the edge had changed. Less threat, more question. Like he was trying to understand what kind of woman wipes blood from a stranger's face after a near execution. My apron was still soaked, black fabric glued to my skin. There was blood on it that wasn't mine. Every time I looked at the stains, my stomach tightened, because the night kept replaying itself in flashes. Wind on the balcony, the empty click, the mercenary's muzzle finding me, and then that single crack from nowhere that rewrote the ending. I stared at the window and tried to find the angle in my head. Distant rooftop, clean line, no hesitation. The shot had a signature you could feel more than see. My father used to warn me that some people leave fingerprints in the air. Tonight, someone had left one on my life, and I didn't know if it meant rescue or ownership. Caleb's face rose up in the quiet like a bruise you finally notice. 7 years old, soft hair, a freckle near his left eyebrow. I pictured him asleep with the nightlight glowing and the lunchbox on the counter because I always packed it before bed. Then the fear landed hard. If Victor's cleanup team wanted me erased, they wouldn't stop at me. They would find my address, my shift schedule, my kids' school, and anyone close enough to hurt. That shame was physical. I was here, in a room that smelled like smoke, while my son existed in a world that didn't know it had become dangerous. I wanted to call him. I didn't. A call was a beacon. So was fear. A mother's voice can be traced, recorded, and used. Gavin peeled off his wet coat, and the motion made him wince. His eyes closed for one beat, the smallest crack in the boss's mask. And it hit me how betrayal lands even on men who think they planned for everything. He wasn't soft. He was exhausted, and that made him sharper. He checked his phone, then another, then the third he carried like habit. I watched his face change in tiny, disciplined increments. Confusion, then anger held back so hard it turned into stillness. His fingers moved faster, tapping, trying different contacts and accounts. Nothing opened the way it should. I didn't need to see the screens to understand. Money is oxygen in his world. Cut it off, and even a Dock King starts suffocating. The realization settled over the room like dust. This wasn't only Victor trying to steal a throne with bullets. This was someone freezing accounts, locking routes, choking the arteries that kept Gavin's empire moving. A war you could fight with signatures and timestamps. A war that would keep hunting us even if we hid for days under flickering neon. I tightened my grip on the towel until my knuckles went white. Hiding was a pause, not an answer. The lion's mouth was still open back in the city, and whatever waited inside it had my face now. The motel room had stopped pretending it was a shelter. Gavin sat on the edge of the bed with his phone glowing, cutting his face into hard angles, tapping through screens that should have opened doors. Nothing moved the way money is supposed to move when you are the man who owns the docks. It wasn't just a lockout. It was approvals denied, routes rerouted, and a slow squeeze on every vein that kept his world breathing. I watched his focus narrow. The calm in him didn't mean peace. It meant math. He confirmed what my gut had already whispered since the penthouse went dark. Ethan Mercer wasn't simply compromised. Ethan was steering Gavin's liquidity into someone else's hands, and the transfer clock was running for Victor Sloane's benefit. The air changed when that landed. Bullets were loud. Money was quiet. Money could buy silence. It could buy a cop's pause at the wrong second. It could buy a judge's calendar. It could buy a whole city the way a man buys a drink, like it was nothing. And if Victor got that kind of leverage, he wouldn't just hunt Gavin. He would erase everyone who helped him live. He would clean up loose ends with paperwork and men in plain coats. He would find my address because my face wasn't invisible anymore, and my son would be the easiest pressure point. Caleb's face flashed so sharply it made my throat close. The way he sleeps curled on his side, one fist tucked under his chin like he's still small enough to fit inside my palm. The thought of him waking up and calling for me in an empty apartment hit harder than gunfire. This wasn't about pride. This was about making it back to him alive. Hiding would only delay the net. Gavin knew it. I saw the moment he stopped trying to bully the system into obeying and started hunting the choke point. There is always a choke point. Even the cleanest theft has to be authorized somewhere, by somebody with a hand on the mechanism. That mechanism was the vault, not a bank. A private financial facility, the kind of place rich men used when they didn't want their money to have fingerprints. Gavin had used it before, and if the master authorization had to be executed physically, then Ethan would have to be there to seal the betrayal in person. My father's rule rose up like a pulse. Patterns over promises. Ethan's promise of help had been bait. The pattern was controlled. The pattern was timing. The pattern was a door already open for the wrong people. We didn't have time for a long plan. We had time for a costume change. I dug through Gavin's duffel like it was a supply closet and pulled out contractor coveralls, a dark cap, and work gloves. I grabbed the motel notepad and made a clipboard out of cardboard and tape. It didn't have to be perfect. It had to pass at a glance. Gavin's instinct fought it. Men like him survive by looking big, but big gets remembered. The trick was to look like you belonged to the building more than the building belonged to you. He swallowed whatever pride tasted like and pulled the coveralls on. The dock king in grease-stained blue, shoulders still dangerous, suddenly small enough to slip through a doorway without being noticed. It was grim. It was necessary. I kept our carry light. One weapon, spare magazine, a small flashlight, zip ties, and a cleaning cart borrowed from the hallway, stocked with towels and an all-purpose cleaner bottle that looked like maintenance supplies. I turned off our phones and wrapped them in a towel inside the cart like they were something that could betray us just by existing. Before we left, I cracked the curtain and studied the parking lot. No headlights lingering. No engine idling too long. Still, I set my mind on the next door, the next camera, the next face that might look twice. Gavin started the car, and the engine sounded too loud in the wet night. As we pulled back onto the road, the skyline returned like a line of teeth. Downtown lights burned against low clouds. The financial district sat ahead, bright and cold, the lion's mouth open and waiting. I didn't feel brave. I felt committed. Because once you walk back into a place that wants you dead, you don't get to pretend you were only passing through. Pre-dawn in Boston is a color you can taste. Not sunrise, not night, just damp gray, harbor wind, and the city holding its breath. The vault rose out of it like a blank tooth. Glass, pale stone, no sign big enough to admit what it really was. A place built for money that hates witnesses. My contractor's coveralls scratched my neck. The cap sat low. The cleaning cart squeaked every third roll. A tiny betrayal I couldn't fully fix. I let it squeak anyway. People expect maintenance to sound annoying. Gavin walked half a step behind me with a tool bag that looked real because it was heavy, and because he'd learned how to keep his face calm when his life was on fire. The lobby smelled like filtered air and polish, marble that reflected our boots. 2 guards at a desk, 1 bored, 1 sharp, a badge gate, a camera dome, a sign about private property pretending to be polite. I held the clipboard like it was a nuisance. Work order on top, stamped and simple. Ventilation intake issue, basement service access, urgent air quality compliance. Behind the desk, a line of men in suits waited with the tight patience of people who believe time belongs to them. That line was my leverage. Impatience makes strangers cooperative. The bored guard kept checking his watch. The sharp guard watched hands. I watched habits. Which corner they ignored. How quickly they wanted the line to move. I didn't smile. I didn't plead. I performed mild irritation the way real workers do when a building calls them in too early. I slid the clipboard forward and let the words do the work. Nobody wants an air problem that becomes paperwork. The bored guard waved us through with relief. The sharp one hesitated, eyes flicking to Gavin's shoulders, to the tool bag, to my cart. I held his gaze like I'd make this his headache if he slowed me down. The gate buzzed. We were in. Relief hit my ribs and vanished. Inside isn't safe. Inside is committed. I thought of Caleb for 1 sharp heartbeat, not as comfort but as a deadline, because dead mothers don't get second chances. Past the lobby, everything turned sterile. Carpet became sealed tile. The air got colder, recycled, and dry. Cameras stared from corners. Card readers blinked like tiny judgments. We took a maintenance lift with a metal grate door and a panel of restricted levels. My badge didn't need to open everything, just enough to keep us moving. The lift dropped. The city disappeared. Level markers turned to B numbers. Down here, the corridors were narrow, painted tired off-white, with pipes overhead and the constant whisper of ventilation. It smelled faintly of bleach and metal, and the kind of cleanliness nobody lives in. I found an intake junction alcove tucked between 2 camera angles, a blind spot made by lazy architecture. I steered the cart into it as I belonged there, like the squeak was normal, like my heart wasn't trying to punch through my ribs. Gavin's eyes asked questions without asking. I answered with motion. I popped the cart lid and showed him the boring guts of a boring job. Glass cleaner, disinfectant, bathroom spray, a can of compressed air, paper towels, and cheap masks. Nothing that looked like a weapon because it wasn't. This was about protocols and panic, not bodies. My father's rule came back like a steady drum. Systems default to safety, and humans default to leaving. I mixed a non-lethal irritant fog from what I had enough to burn eyes and throats, enough to make people cough and back away, not enough to put anyone in the ground. I taped a funnel to the intake grate, set the bottle in place, and rigged a timed release using pressure and a weak seal that would fail on schedule. Crude, reliable. It didn't need a genius. It needed rules. I slid the panel closed. My gloves squeaked on metal. The sound felt loud as a confession. Then I set the countdown on my watch and angled it so Gavin could see. When the sensors detected air quality, the building would protect itself by protecting people. Emergency mode would trigger. Non-critical magnetic locks would release. Movement restrictions would loosen. Guards would start herding instead of hunting. Gavin swallowed whatever pride he had left. His stance shifted from king to shadow, matching my rhythm. We pushed the cart out and walked like we were late, annoyed, harmless. Every step costs a second. Every camera felt like an eye I had to lie to. Ahead, the corridor widened into a checkpoint I hadn't counted on. 2 guards with earpieces and heavier posture, hands resting near their belts like they expected trouble. Past them, a steel-framed door with a scanner that looked newly installed. And near the far wall, half-shadowed by ductwork, a man in clean tactical gear stood watching the hall like he was waiting for something to start. My watch ticked. The ventilation trick was about to breathe, and the building, for the first time, was starting to look back. The alarm didn't scream like fire. It coughed first, an ugly chime for air quality, not mercy. Somewhere above us, the building chose evacuation over secrecy, and I felt it in the corridor. Magnetic locks thunking loose, vents changing pitch. The recycled air smelled faintly of bleach and metal. The 2 guards in the secure hallway turned their heads together. That synchronized movement told me they weren't regular security. They were hired to hold a line. Gavin's shoulder brushed mine as we moved. No heroics, just instinct. I rolled the squeaky cart straight at them like annoyed maintenance. And when one stepped forward to stop me, I made the floor the problem. Cleaner glistened. His boot slid. Balance broke. Gavin used that half-second the way he'd used power his whole life, decisive, brutal, contained. A shove into the wall, an elbow, breath knocked out. I snatched the dropped access badge. Hands mattered more than faces. The other guard reached for his weapon. I didn't outgun him. I outtimed him. The cart hit his knees, his stance collapsed, and I slammed the service door while Gavin dragged us through. Metal clanged. A lock failed to catch because emergency mode didn't care about hierarchy. For the first time all night, the building helped us. Cold punched my lungs as the server room seal opened. Inside was manufactured winter dry, freezing, clean enough to feel hostile. Blue light washed the racks and screens that could buy a city and bury it. Ethan Mercer sat at the console as he belonged there. No coveralls, no frantic arrival. A suit jacket hung over a chair, sleeves rolled up, fingers moving with the steady confidence of someone already home. On the main screen, a progress bar crawled toward completion. My stomach dropped with the sick satisfaction of being right. The timeline that didn't add up hadn't been a mistake. Ethan hadn't been racing to help Gavin. He'd been here first, guiding the money out while men with earpieces closed in to deliver the receipt. Ethan's body betrayed him anyway. Sweat at his hairline in an ice-cold room. A tremor in the fingers hovering over the keys. Eyes flicking to the door, counting seconds. He wasn't calm. He was performing calmly. Gavin stopped behind me, and the air felt heavier. He didn't lunge. He didn't explode. He held still with a discipline that scared me more than violence, because it meant he was choosing leverage over revenge. Ethan's rationalizing spilled out without needing words I could quote. He tried to make betrayal sound like math, like inevitability, like a clean transaction. He kept watching Gavin's hands, measuring whether Gavin would kill him before the transfer finished. That told me Ethan believed the lie he'd sold himself. That fear could be justified if it wore a suit. The motive came in ugly human pieces. Debt that wasn't just money but humiliation. A hook set deep, someone Ethan loved, someone Victor could squeeze. A promise of safety if Ethan switched sides early, a threat of ruin if he didn't. Cowardice dressed as responsibility. The progress bar crept closer to the end. The ventilation alarm's chime echoed faintly through the walls, and under it I heard what mattered approaching footsteps, heavier and confident. Tools scraping metal. Victor's people weren't searching. They were converging. I stepped closer to the screen and forced my brain to stay plain. You can't just stop this kind of transfer and call it done. Halfway still leaves a trail. Still leaves access. Still leaves Victor enough to finish later. The only real options were costly. Send the money somewhere unreachable, or burn it so nobody could use it. My throat tasted like bleach and adrenaline. Caleb flashed in my mind, damp hair after a bath, small fingers on my wrist when he didn't want me to leave. If Victor bought the city, he'd buy the people meant to protect my son, too. There would be no safe doorstep to return to. Ethan's hands hovered over the keyboard like a man waiting for permission to be forgiven. Gavin's presence pressed in behind me like a blade held back. The door handle rattled once, then again. Metal groaned. A breach is starting. I made the decision before fear could vote. I leaned toward Ethan and gave him one last chance to choose what kind of man he'd be in the next 10 seconds. Then I lifted my hand over the keys, ready to burn the throne with one command as the door began to give. Cold air turned every breath into a small white cloud that floated up and vanished into the blue glow of the racks. The fans never stopped, a constant mechanical hush that made the drilling at the door sound even uglier by contrast. The alarm that had started as a polite cough had grown teeth, pulsing like the building was warning us it was about to choose violence over protocol. On the screen, the transfer bar sat so close to the end it felt like a dare. A few more seconds and Victor Sloan would have more than Gavin's money. He would have leverage, judges, inspectors, cops who looked the other way because someone paid their debt. The kind of power that didn't need a gun in a supper club because it could make paperwork kill you later. My hand hovered above the keyboard, steady in a way that scared me. Training does that. Fear becomes something you fold into a clean edge. But this wasn't a target on a basement wall. This was a choice that would stain whoever made it. Gavin stood behind me, close enough that I could feel his heat. Here, he was a man watching his empire balance on a single line of text. Ethan Mercer sat to my left, sweat shining at his hairline, eyes darting to the door like it might open and save him. He looked like someone who had tried to sell fear as logic, and found out the buyer still wanted blood. My father's rule rose in me the way it always did when things got loud. Pattern over promises. The pattern was simple. If we pushed the money back to Gavin, Victor would chase it. If we hid it, Victor would freeze it. If we fought for it, Victor would buy the people who decided who owned it. Winning the transfer didn't win the war. It just changed whose hands were on the chain. So I turned my fear into a question, not a speech. I framed it the only way that mattered. The way a mother frames danger when her kid is asleep. And the world is full of teeth. Was Gavin willing to lose his throne so a worse man couldn't inherit it? Was he willing to be smaller if it meant strangers stayed alive? If it meant my son Caleb got to walk into school without a shadow behind him? I didn't say Caleb's name out loud. I didn't have to. He lived in my throat like a prayer I was too tired to finish. Gavin's stillness cracked in tiny ways. A flex of his jaw. A breath held, then released. For a heartbeat, I saw the boy under the Dock King. The one who learned early that being feared was safer than being loved. I saw legacy in his eyes, the ghost of whoever taught him that you only mattered if you owned something no one could take, and I saw the terror underneath it, the terror of becoming ordinary, of becoming nothing. That was the test. Not whether he could kill Victor, not whether he could outspend him, whether he could refuse to become him. I held my boundary like a door I wouldn't open. I wasn't going to be the weapon that preserved cruelty just because it wore Gavin's face instead of Victor's. I had already stepped out of invisibility. I wasn't stepping into ownership. The drilling screamed, metal groaning. The latch shuddered. Boots thudded in the hall, measured and confident. These weren't panicked men. They were professionals arriving to collect what they'd been paid to collect. Ethan made a small choking sound, the kind of noise guilt makes when it finally understands consequence. It was a mirror held up to the room. Choosing the winning side had hollowed him out and left him begging at the feet of whoever still had options. My fingers lowered to the keys. I didn't press anything yet. The last seconds were a narrow bridge, and I needed to know who I was walking with. Gavin's hand came into my peripheral vision, not grabbing, not stopping me, just there, open, offered. Permission without softness, consent without surrender. His eyes met mine, and the decision in them was brutal in its honesty. He would rather burn than be owned. I moved. I selected the only destination that wasn't a destination. Not a rival account. Not a hidden vault. A null sink that would swallow the fortune and leave nothing to chase. The system flashed warnings in bright red, begging for reconsideration. Begging for a signature that meant permanence. I confirmed it. The purge began. A new bar replacing the old one. Climbing fast as the door finally buckled and the first crack of light split the frame wide open. The purge bar climbed like a heartbeat on a monitor. Blue light washed my hands, then the screen flashed a warning color, as if the building itself had turned its head to stare at what I'd done. The air felt sharper, colder. My breath kept fogging in front of my face, and the fans in the racks never changed pitch, like machines don't care who loses everything. A confirmation line appeared in plain language. Assets redirected to a null destination. Transfer irrecoverable. Balance unavailable. The numbers that had represented Gavin's entire reign collapsed into nothing, as if someone had yanked a crown off a skull and thrown it into deep water. For half a second, I felt it. That clean release. We'd done it. Victor couldn't buy the city now. Caleb could still have a life where the worst threat was a late bus, and not a man who treated people like receipts. Then the server room door finally gave. Metal screamed. The frame buckled. A wedge of hallway light cut across the floor, and with it came smoke, boots, and that particular sound of professionals entering a space they already consider owned. The blue-lit cold turned crowded with heat and breath and gun oil. Victor Sloan appeared in that opening like a verdict. He moved slowly, confidently, flanked by men in dark gear who kept their muzzles low but ready, scanning corners like they were reading a blueprint. His gaze hit the monitor first. He saw the red. He saw the transfer bar replaced by a dead confirmation. And something in the room changed. Not from alarms, but from the moment he understood the money was gone in a way he couldn't undo. Ethan made a small sound beside me and folded in on himself like a man whose spine had been replaced with paper. Victor's composure didn't crack into shouting. It sharpened. His attention slid from the screen to Gavin with the intimacy of a knife. This wasn't just about killing him. This was about humiliation. Gavin had denied him the throne, and Victor needed the story to end with him standing over a body so the city would believe he was inevitable anyway. Gavin stepped in front of me without touching me. A wall that didn't ask permission. Protection, not ownership. He was bruised, wet at the cuffs, and still somehow heavy with authority. I moved because stillness is how you die alone. I slid sideways into the narrow aisle between racks, putting metal and humming equipment between my body and the doorway. I checked my weapon by feel. I counted what I had left in my head, not because I thought I could win a gunfight, but because knowing your limits is the only way to survive them. Victor's men began to compress the room, taking angles, turning the racks into a maze we'd lose inside. There was no clean exit, just a pressure cooker made of metal aisles and cold air. Somewhere above us, the ventilation diversion we'd set earlier finally rippled into this level. The ceiling vents clicked. A sensor chirped, then the lights stuttered, blue going dim for a beat, coming back as a harsh emergency wash. A synthetic announcement rolled through the ceiling speakers, calm as a receptionist, describing a containment event and an automatic lockdown. Magnetic locks thunked. A heavy door somewhere in the corridor slammed shut with finality. Victor's team paused for the first time, their heads tilting slightly as they listened for the system's next move. A single shot cracked, not loud like a rifle, more like a sharp punch in a sealed room. One of Victor's men jerked, his weapon flipping out of his hands as if the air had slapped it away. He hit the floor hard, clutching an arm that suddenly didn't work. Another shot followed, just as precise. A second man dropped to a knee, his leg folding wrong, his face still blank with disbelief. No spray, no panic fire. Whoever was doing it knew exactly what to take and what to leave. Victor shifted behind the doorframe, dragging one of his people into partial cover with a grip that looked practiced. He wasn't surprised by danger. He was surprised by the kind of danger. This wasn't Gavin's crew rushing in. This wasn't a cop raid with yelling and chaos. This was surgical. I pressed my shoulder against the rack and scanned the sliver of hallway I could see. The shots weren't coming from inside the room. They were threading the doorway from an angle Victor hadn't cleared, like someone had been waiting with patience and line of sight. Then the intercom clicked again, and a voice cut in over the building's system, low and controlled, using a cadence that made my stomach drop. Not a name, not a threat. A simple instruction delivered like a rule. The same kind of rule my father used to instill in my bones when he wanted me alive more than he wanted me comfortable. My blood went cold because I recognized the rhythm, the deliberate pause before the final word, the way it sounded like mercy and warning at the same time. Victor's head lifted, eyes narrowing, and for the first time, I saw uncertainty flicker behind his control. The room wasn't ours anymore. It belonged to whoever had just taken the lights, the locks, and the line of fire. The server room went strangely quiet after the purge started, like the building itself was listening to what we'd just done. The progress bar on the monitor kept moving, ruthless and calm, while Victor Sloane's men froze at the busted doorway with their rifles half raised, no longer sure who owned the next second. The intercom clicked. A voice slid through the ceiling speakers with the same controlled patience that used to fill my childhood home. Older now, rough at the edges, but built from the exact same cadence. The pause before the last word, the way certainty sounded, was almost gentle. My stomach dropped so hard I tasted pennies. The grip of my pistol went slick in my palm. The room blurred, lights smearing like rain on glass, and my knees threatened to fold. I had buried that voice. I'd mourned it until mourning became a routine. I had stood over an empty coffin and told myself the world didn't return what it took. Gavin shifted closer, angling his body between me and the doorway on instinct. But his eyes weren't hunting Victor anymore. They were on me, on the way. My whole face betrayed me. The voice didn't explain. It demonstrated, somewhere in the building, locks engaged with a heavy clunk that I felt through the floor. On the security monitor, a stairwell camera panned by itself, tracking a steel shutter dropping into place. Another feed snapped to the loading dock, where a gate sealed shut. This wasn't a panicked lockdown. It was steering. A new alert populated the main screen in plain language. Clean agent standby. Oxygen displacement protocol armed. Victor's posture tightened. His team's confidence hitched as they glanced up at vents and sprinklers the way professionals do when they realize the environment has turned into an opponent. The voice laid out the math in the simplest terms. If Victor pushed forward, the room would become a box with less air and more confusion. A fire suppression protocol would flood the space with inert gas, steal breath, and make everyone crawl. Enough to end a firefight without turning it into a massacre. Relief tried to lift me. Rage followed it like a shadow. All those years of rules. The new name, the careful apartment, Caleb's backpack by the door. Every night I checked the windows. Every morning, I acted normal because normal was the closest thing to armor I could afford. He had watched. He had known. And he had let me carry it alone. In my mind, the basement flashed. Concrete floor, dust, the sting of a thrown tennis ball against my forearm because I'd flinch wrong. The lesson about doorways. The rule about patterns over promises. About trusting timing more than words. Hearing him now felt like that old correction tap on my shoulder. And it made me furious, because it also made me feel safe. Victor tried to reclaim the room with presence, shifting like his ego could intimidate oxygen. But the voice didn't argue with him. It spoke to the building around him, to cameras, to locks, to protocols. Victor wasn't the apex predator anymore. He was just a man standing inside someone else's architecture. Another crack echoed from somewhere distant, sharp and surgical. A rifle barrel at the doorway sparked, knocked sideways, the shooter's hand jerking back in pain but still alive. The warning was clear. You can keep breathing, or you can keep fighting, but not both. Gavin's power recalibrated in real time. I felt it in the way his shoulders eased a fraction, in the way he stopped trying to dominate the moment and started protecting my choice. He didn't speak over me. He watched my face like he was learning what respect actually costs. My throat tightened until swallowing hurt. Part of me wanted to run toward that voice like a child. Part of me wanted to tear it apart like a woman who had paid every bill alone. The monitor feed shifted again. Once, a man stepped into frame in a service corridor. Older, thinner in the face, hair gone more gray than I remembered, cut short and practical. Dark clothes that didn't try to look expensive, just useful. His eyes were the same as ever. Not soft, not cruel, just awake. The intercom carried him closer, as if he'd moved to a handset on purpose. He laid out reality like a rule. Victor and his men could walk out alive if they backed away now. Gavin would live if he stayed still for the next few seconds. And I had a choice, because the one thing he couldn't control was what I did with my own feet. Disappear with him again, and become the kind of ghost no one could track, and Caleb might stay safe. Or stay here, in the fire I'd lit, and rebuild with boundaries, knowing every shadow in the city would start hunting my name. I stared at the screen, at his face, at the years between us stretched tight like wire. My hands finally stopped shaking. Whatever I chose next, it would be mine. The moment my father's voice became undeniable, my body did what it always did after surviving. It started counting. Exits, angles, breath. My ears rang. My palms were slick around the pistol. The server room stayed cold, blue-lit, humming like a machine that didn't care who lived. Outside the door, Victor Sloan and his professionals were stuck in a humiliating pause. Not defeated, contained. I watched Victor's eyes flick from vents to ceiling speakers to the cameras that had stopped belonging to him. A cornered man doesn't become harmless. He becomes patient. The building's alarms kept rippling from my fog diversion, distant sprinklers, muffled footsteps, a public address loop stuttering through protocol. My father had the place by the throat with access. Locks, sensors, and the kind of leverage he'd warned me about when I was still a kid in a basement. He didn't waste time on reunion. He laid out an escape route the way he laid out rules. Clean, efficient, non-negotiable. A service stair he could open. A vehicle was staged nearby. A new name is waiting. If I took it, I could vanish again before anyone finished searching for my face. The offer landed like a chain. Disappear, reset, obey. I had built my life around those verbs because they kept Caleb alive. They kept me employed. They kept me bored. And I hated how much part of me still wanted to say yes just to stop the ache. My mind flashed the empty coffin, the folded flag, the well-meaning hands on my shoulders. The years after, when every holiday felt like walking through glass. I remembered choosing waitressing because it made me background noise. Ordinary wasn't my failure. Ordinary was my dream. Victor shifted, trying to reclaim control with posture alone, and I felt my father's pressure tighten. Some unseen command held the room like a fist. Victor's men lowered their muzzles a fraction, not out of mercy, but out of math. If my father hit the switch he was holding, they would lose air or sight long enough to die. The threat didn't need volume to be believed. Gavin Rowe stood near me in borrowed coveralls, bruised and bleeding through the grime. His Doc King aura had been stripped down to something raw. A man who'd chosen to burn his own money, rather than hand Boston to a worse predator. He kept his body between me and the doorway on instinct, then eased back. He didn't compete with my father. He didn't try to claim me for staying. He made space for my decision. That steadiness hit me harder than fear. My father's plan was safety, but it was also ghosthood. It meant teaching Caleb that his mother belonged to shadows. It meant living as a moving target forever. Never planting roots, never letting my kid forget to look over his shoulder. It meant surviving, yes, but never building. And building was the part of me that had been starving. I wasn't thinking about romance. I wasn't chasing glory. I was thinking about the kind of woman I wanted my son to remember. Not just a survivor. Not just a weapon that ran when told. A protector who could stand in daylight, and still keep her people safe. A builder. An anchor. Mother as a role, not just a title. So I drew my boundaries in my head like lines on a map. Truth, not half-truths. Autonomy, not custody. No more being handled like an asset on someone else's board. The right to walk away if Caleb became the price. A plan that kept civilians from becoming collateral. If I stayed, it would be on purpose and on my terms. My father didn't soften, but something in his gaze shifted recognition, maybe, or grief he refused to name. He gave me one last rule, the way he always did. If I chose daylight, I had to choose it completely. No looking back when the shadows tried to bargain. I didn't follow him to the exit he'd opened. I let the ache sit in my throat and stay there. I watched him angle away from the cameras, already turning into the thing he did best. Then I turned toward Gavin, toward the wreck of his empire and the city Victor still wanted to buy. And I chose to stay with conditions, with my spine straight, with my life no longer hidden. I stayed, and I felt the point of no return lock into place like a door I was done being afraid of. At 7:45 p.m., I unlock the front door before the line outside becomes a headline. The cinder room smells like fresh paint trying to cover smoke, and my fingers pause on the new brass hinge plate like I'm checking a pulse. The lighter at the host stand clicks once when I test the first candle. That tiny sound tells me the room is breathing again tonight. Outside, Boston Seaport keeps moving. People in coats and heels wait beneath the canopy, smiling into their phones like the past can be edited out. The public story is simple. Reopening, resilience, a glamorous return. The private truth is still lodged in my body. Even with the base low and the glass polished, I can still taste fear in the back of my throat. We rebuilt the room like you rebuild a spine. New velvet on the banquettes, darker and tighter. The aquarium wall is gone, swapped for a textured panel that won't explode into knives. The tables are spaced wider, so no one gets trapped in a funnel. Cameras are visible now, not hidden. Panic buttons sit under the bar rail and at every server station. The kitchen door cannot lock from the outside anymore. A short hallway behind the pastry fridge is a safe room with water, a first aid kit, and a phone that calls out. Those details are not decor. They are rules, right now. I walk the floor with a clipboard that isn't theater anymore. I test the silent alarm. I watch my staff move through their routes, and I adjust a turning point near the service well so a young busser will never have to squeeze past a stranger's hands. I do it calmly, because fear makes people sloppy, and sloppiness is how bodies end up on tile. Before we open, I gather everyone in the back corridor. I keep it plain and human. No guest gets to corner them. No manager gets to threaten shifts for silence. No one gets to touch without consent. If someone feels wrong, they step away and press the button, and the room pauses. We protect each other first. Gavin arrives without a parade. He still looks like the dock king the city used to whisper about, but he moves like someone who has learned what consequences cost. He doesn't stand at the center. He stays slightly behind me as I check the host stand, close enough to cover, far enough not to claim. When his attention lands on me, it feels like a question, not an order. He offers support in ways that can be refused, and I refuse when I need to, because being seen only matters if you are allowed to say no. I feel my father's absence like a bruise you forget until you touch it. I remember the empty coffin, the years I spent following his rules and calling it safety. Love can be real and still be a wound. Being saved does not erase being abandoned. I carry both truths without collapsing, because I do not have the luxury of only feeling one thing at a time. The doors open. Jazz hums low. Crystal clinks. A fresh batch of ice hits a shaker, and the sound lands in my chest like a steady drum. The first guests drift in, polished and hungry. I watch hands, not smiles. I watch the way a man angles his chair like he expects a fight, and I meet his gaze without flinching. Not hostile, not afraid, present. This is what I know now, and I say it without pretending it's pretty. Survival does not equal innocence. Love does not erase violence. Power does not become clean because it wears silk. Dignity is something you practice, daily, in choices that cost you. It is deciding what you will and will not allow, even inside an ecosystem that will never be pure. The city keeps turning, the machine keeps humming, but tonight the cinder room reopens like a controlled burn. Elegance on the surface, new rules underneath. And I stand inside it without disappearing, not because I am safe, but because I am mine. If you have ever had to choose between vanishing and building, between running and staying, tell me what you chose and what it cost you. Leave your moment in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, like it, share it, and pass it to someone who needs the reminder that dignity can be rebuilt.